All right, we are going to get started with this first unit here in geometry. And something that this unit focuses on a lot is kind of you getting used to some of the language that we're going to use inside geometry, some of the vocab that we have that's going to be used like all year long. And so we're going to be a little bit vocab heavy in this first unit. Now, we're not going to go through all the vocab words today. Okay, we're going to kind of chunk it up, and as we talk about things, we'll kind of start introducing new terms to you. But this sheet that I have on the very first page of your packet is going to be kind of a catch-all for all the vocab words that we're going to talk about. Okay, so I've got a couple of vocab words that we're going to go over today, but before we even get into that, I have a little bit of an activity that I'm going to throw up here for you guys. So I want you guys to look at this screen right now. And I don't need you to talk out loud at the moment. I just need you to kind of look and think. I want you to pick a point here. Pick any dot that you see on your screen. And I want you to try to think, how would I describe where my dot is to someone else? So I'm going to give you like a minute here, and I want you to think about if you had to turn to your partner or turn to the person sitting next to you, or even you were talking to me, and I had to be able to pinpoint where your dot is. How would you describe it to me or to the person next to you? Okay, so I want you to take a minute here. I want you to pick one of the dots that you see, and I want you to think about how you would describe it. Okay. Now, I would probably at this point ask for some volunteers here, okay? And I would want you to maybe try to describe where your dot is, okay? But if you're watching this recording, I am not currently recording this video with a live class, okay? This recording is being done in the case that I'm gone and you guys need to watch the notes for today. So for the recording, what I'm going to do is I'm going to describe maybe one or two dots to you. We'll kind of see what we do here. And I want you just, as you're watching the video, whether you guys are watching this as a class or you're watching this individually on your own, I want you to try to see if you can figure out what dot I'm talking about. Okay? So the dot that I am looking at, I would consider it to be in the fourth column and in like the second row. Okay, so I said it would be in the fourth column, second row. So I want you to kind of just use that, and hopefully you remember the differences between columns and rows. But when you're looking at this here, you may be a little bit hesitant to maybe guess. And if I asked you to maybe gauge how confident you were, I'm sure some of you would feel maybe like 50-50. You think you could maybe tell me which one it is. Maybe some of you would feel a little less confident. Maybe some of you would feel really confident that you know what I'm talking about. Okay, so let's see if I can, I didn't want to do that. I was going to see if I could maybe draw on this. I don't know if I can. Let me see if I could. I wonder if I could download this. Here, let's try this maybe. Well, okay. There we go. All right, now I should be able to draw on it. So I said that it was in the fourth column, second row. Now, hopefully you can kind of see my red dot here. I would maybe think that like this is the like the row. Like here's a row, maybe here's a row, and maybe here's a row. I don't know. It starts to get kind of hard though, because like where do these dots go? Like where do they belong? And when you're thinking about like columns, like this could be a column. This could be a column. But then when you start to get over here, like do you start, is this a column? Like, does it include this dot or not? Like, how does this column work? Like, it starts to get really hard, really fast, right? So when I said it was in the fourth column, second row, I was thinking about that dot right there. Did any of you get it right when you were watching this? Maybe you did. Maybe you didn't. Maybe you were totally off. Maybe you were like, well, I was lost on what you said when you said columns and rows because I don't know what's what. Okay. Let me give you a different one. The point I'm looking at is in the middle of the screen at the bottom. The middle of the screen at the bottom. Okay. Again, you might be feeling somewhat confident. You might be feeling not confident at all. You might be able to come up here and point to the point that I'm talking about and be perfectly correct. The dot that I'm referring to is that one. To me, that looks like it would be about in the middle of the dots. And I would say that that's kind of on the bottom because there's no dot down here underneath it. So that's why I called it the bottom. But again, if you're not really clear what I mean when I say in the middle or at the bottom, or if I start using words like columns and rows, it can get really confusing really fast, right? So what if I add a little bit of description to my photo? Okay, so what if I go to this slide? Do you think it would be easier now to describe what dot you're looking at? If I said I want you guys all to look at the dot with the letter B by it, do you think you would know what point I'm talking about? There's only one letter B and it's right there. So I would hope that if I said that, you would be able to look at exactly that dot. Or if I said, look at the dot that has the letter T next to it, you would be able to look at that one. So you can kind of see how now that I've added this description, it gets a lot easier for me to have to maybe describe what point I was talking about, right? So the reason why I wanted us to start out with this is because when we're in geometry, it's really important that when I start talking about things and I start referring to things in a picture, that you would know exactly what I'm talking about and that there wouldn't be any guess on the words I was using, the language that I was maybe using as I described something to you, or if I was talking about something, there's not a lot of like thinking or guessing about where I'm at. You would know exactly where to look. Okay. It's really important as we go forward that you understand how we label things in geometry and the way we call certain items in geometry, because I don't want you guys to be spending the time when I'm talking about a problem to be like given the pieces of a puzzle and you're trying to put them together. Instead, I want you to be able to kind of see the puzzle as a whole and that you just have one little piece to have to put back in because that's the piece that I'm talking about with my problem. So instead of having to spend all this time of like trying to wrap your head around what exactly it is that I'm talking about, I think it would be a better use of our time if we talk about some of these vocab words so that you would know exactly what I mean when I'm getting into some of these pictures and diagrams and stuff. Okay. So if you guys come here to your vocab sheet, the first thing that we're going to add is a point. Okay. So that kind of branches right off of that activity. So right here in your first word, go ahead and write point. Okay. A point in geometry is a single location It doesn't really have a shape or a size. Okay, a point is just talking about something that we're referring to. And it's just kind of holding its place at that specific location, but it doesn't have like, it's not bigger or smaller. The size doesn't really matter here. We're just talking about where something is. All of us would be considered points. Okay, we're all sitting at a location. Like, you guys are maybe sitting in your desk, or maybe you're sitting in your chair during study hall or at home while you're watching this video. Where you're sitting at right now is a point. Okay, there's other points that we can see if we kind of were to look around a room. Like, if you look at the corners of anything, like the corners of a picture frame, the corners of a TV screen, like those tiny corners would be considered points. If you look at the end of your pencil or your pen, whatever it is that you're writing with, that would be a point. Okay, it's just talking about a location that something has. Now, what these look like in a picture is you're going to have a dot, okay? And next to the dot, we put a capital letter. So it could be a standalone point like that, or it could be where two things meet. So maybe something like this, where we have like the corner of something. There's always going to be, though, a capital letter that we use. So for the notation, we're using a capital letter. So anytime that we have points, and you'll see this in pictures where we have shapes and they have the points on there, they're always going to use capital letters to name the points of a shape. Okay, some examples of where lines would be are when we have lines that cross, so lines that are crossing, intersection, of maybe like the bricks that are on the walls in my classroom. All those corners would all be points. Okay, some non-examples. So these would be things that I don't want to see when we're talking about points. Is we don't want a dot and then have a lowercase letter next to it. We always want to have a capital letter. The other thing is, I don't want you to just draw a dot. Okay, I don't want there to be a missing label. Everything should have a label in geometry so that someone would know exactly what you're talking about. And it kind of goes back to that activity. It's really hard to know what point I was talking about when I didn't have all those letters next to it. It gets kind of hard to describe where those points are at. So we want to make sure that we have the label sitting next to it at all times, okay? And we want it to be a capital letter. All right, the next vocab word that I want you to put on your sheet here is when you start to have multiple points put together, you start to create lines. So go ahead and write line for your next word. And the definition of a line is that it is made up of points. A line extends forever. And it cannot be measured. So here's what a line would look like. You'll have a straight segment, and you'll have two arrowheads on either side. And there might be a couple of things on this. You could have capital letters next to the points that are maybe on the line. So I'm going to put an M and an N on those. But then next to your line, you might see like a little lowercase letter. So I'm going to put a little A there. There's a couple of reasons why that's on there. We're going to be able to use the information that's on the line in order to name it. Just like we had specific notation for points on how to name points, we have specific notation for lines as well. Okay, so for a line, it uses two arrowheads when you're naming it. You could have a couple of options here. You could use the two letters M and N, and you're going to draw like a little tiny line right above those letters for the notation. So that would be saying that this is line MN. You could also flip those letters around. So you could do NM instead. And again, it needs to have that line notation above it. Okay, but there is one other option. That had a lowercase letter next to it. So you can actually use that. A lot of times the lowercase letters will be kind of like scripty, almost like a cursive letter, but maybe not like a true cursive letter. So sometimes you'll see things like an M or an N, or you'll see like an L, something like that next to a line. That's kind of what I mean when I'm saying script letters. This one I put a little A next to it, so we could call that line A. Those would all be acceptable names for that line. Okay, so let me draw you another example here. What are some names that you could use for this line? So you can only use 2 letters. So I don't want you to write like DEF or FED. Okay, I only want you to use 2 letters. So you could use any 2 that you want though, and they can go in any order. So you could have said DE. You could have said FD. You could have said EF. You could have said DF. Okay, there's others. There's others that I could write out too. Just know that there's a lot of options there. Okay. Non-examples of lines, so these would be things that are not considered lines, would be graphs that look like this, or maybe a graph that looks like this. Anytime that it starts to become nonlinear, so it's not straight anymore, it starts to have curves to it, or it kind of goes up and down, kind of waves, that's not going to be considered a line anymore because lines are always straight. Those would be specific types of functions for specific types of graphs, but we're not going to really see a whole lot of that in geometry. So we're only going to be focused on those straight lines. All right. Any questions about points and lines so far? Okay. Next vocab word I want you to write down is segment. A segment actually comes from a line, okay? So a segment is a piece of a line with 2 endpoints and it can be measured. So when we talked about lines, I had written up there that a line extends forever and it can't be measured, okay? Now I'm talking about a segment, and a segment comes from a line, but it can be measured, okay? So let's talk about the difference here really quick. So a line had 2 arrowheads on it, and those arrowheads represent that the line goes on forever and ever and ever. Last year when you guys were in algebra, you probably spent a lot of time graphing lines. You had to use like slope and y-intercept in order to graph lines, okay? You're probably still doing a little bit of that in this class too. But when we talk about lines, especially like last year, when you were graphing a line, you maybe only used the slope to get like 2 to 3 points to graph your line just because you needed to know like where it was going to go, okay? But really, if you think about it, you could take any line, figure out what the slope is, and you could use that slope over and over and over and over and over again forever and continue to get more and more points, okay? Now, is it actually possible for us to measure a line? No, because it would go on forever. Is it actually possible for us to graph a line forever? No, because eventually, you're going to pass away. And even if you're graphing a line, like if you made it your life mission, like I'm going to graph this line forever and ever and ever, every day I'm going to add more points to it. Well, the second that you're gone, that line is still going to keep going. Someone else would have to start using the slope to graph your line, okay? So lines go on forever and ever and ever, and because they go on forever, we can't measure that. We can't measure forever. Now, line segments come from a line. They have endpoints. So what they look like is it's still going to be a straight segment, but instead of having those arrowheads, there's going to be 2 dots on either side. Okay, and let's just give these G and H. Now, I am talking about taking a specific portion of a line here. So I took a piece from another piece from that line. Those 2 points are coming straight from a line, but now I should be able to actually measure the line together, okay? Measure that line segment. Okay, so if I were to measure the line segment, I'm going from this point to this point. Kind of think about like the road that connects us to Sioux City, okay? Highway 75. If we're on our way to Sioux City, I can measure how far it is from Lamar's to Sioux City, right? We know how many miles that would be. But does the road only go from Lamar's to Sioux City? No, it keeps going, right? It keeps going in both directions. So think about the entire line, the entire highway as that line that would go on forever and ever and ever. And think about a specified distance, like us to Sioux City or Merrill to Hinton. Okay, think about that distance as your line segment. Now, when you name a line segment, it's very similar to naming a line, but there will be no arrowheads this time. You're still going to use 2 points like GH or HG, but when you put the symbol on top, it's just a line with no arrows. That tells us that we're talking about a segment now and not a line. Okay, so if I give you another example here. What's a line segment that you see in that picture? Again, there's a couple of options, right? You could have said IJ. You could have said JK. You could have said IK. Or you could have switched any of those names around. You could have said KI, KJ, JI. You could have said any of those, and those would also be line segments. Okay, but notice that I'm using that notation on the top to talk about this point to this point. A non-example would be if I had arrows on it. Oh, I'm sorry, I misspoke. This is another example. There are no non-examples for this one, so I'm just going to cross that out. If I had this line, LM, but I was only talking about the distance from L to M, then I could just notate that as a segment. And so that would be another example. You might see the line that the segment came from, but you're still just focused on the line segment. Okay, last word that we're going to add to our sheet for today, and that is the word ray. A ray is also a part of a line. It has one endpoint, and it extends forever in one direction. It's a little bit like a line and a segment kind of mixed together, okay? Because we have an endpoint, but we also have it going forever in one direction, which is very similar to a line. What a ray looks like is you'll have that endpoint and you'll have a ray that kind of comes off of it. So you'll have that arrowhead going in one direction. We'll name that endpoint N and we'll put a point on the line. We'll call that O. When you're naming a ray, you only use one arrow head. And the order matters. put a little star by that. Order matters here. When you're naming a ray, you have to start at the end point and then work your way along the arrow. So for this one, I would have to start at N and go to O. Now, when you use your notation, it looks kind of like a line, but it only has an arrowhead in the one direction, going off to the right there. You could not call this ray ON because the ray is not going in that direction. You have to follow the direction of the ray when you're naming it. Okay, so let me draw you another example here. How would you guys name that ray? Good. Make sure you said P, Q. You have to start at P because that's the end point, and you go towards the arrowhead, so you're going to hit the Q on your way. What if I had, again, I'm not going to have any non-examples here. What if I had a picture that looked like this? What are some rays that you see in this picture? You could say R to T. You could have said R to S. And because we draw that arrowhead, it just lets someone know like the line keeps going beyond S. It doesn't stop at S and it keeps going, and it would eventually go through T. You could have also said ST. Maybe I didn't want the ray to start at R. I wanted it to start at S instead. And so S going again towards T would also be another ray. So those would all be acceptable answers for that problem.